It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Charles Kupchan. Professor Kupchan is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, and professor of international affairs at Georgetown University in the Walsh School of Foreign Service and Department of Government. From 2014 to 2017, Kupchan served as a special assistant to the president and senior director for European affairs on the staff of the National Security Council in the Barack Obama administration. He was also director for European affairs on the NSC during the first Bill Clinton administration. Before joining the Clinton NSC, he worked in the US Department of State on the policy planning staff. Previously, he was an assistant professor of politics at Princeton University. A prolific writer, Charles Kupchan is the author of numerous books and articles on international and strategic affairs, including his most recent work, Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. He recently co-authored a piece in Foreign Affairs with Richard Haass, president of CFR, which was mentioned during the first discussion as well, and I hope that we get a chance to discuss that more, if not in the keynote session in the panel after that. I encourage all of you to read that piece as well. The title of Dr. Kupchan's speech today is The West's Next Challenge, Managing Multipolarity in a Globalized World. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Kupchan.
Thank you very much, Bijan, for the kind introduction and warm welcome. Pleased to be able to spend part of the afternoon with all of you. I'm going to try to be reasonably brief, partly because we only have a half hour and partly because I know that Zach wants to come at me with a few questions before we start the panel. So here I go. I think that this conversation is taking place at what I would call a historical inflection point. We have entered a period in history in which historians will look back and say, boy, that was a moment in which there really was a fundamental shift in the tectonic plates. And I think that shift consists of two big turns. One, a material turn, and one, an ideological turn. The material turn is that we are moving from a world dominated by Western liberal democracies in the United States in particular to a world in which power is much more broadly decentralized. And to simplify, the big shift in the distribution of power that occurred after 1700 from east to west is now being reversed. And power is flowing from west to east. In the year 1700, the two wealthiest countries in the world were China and India. They represented half of global GDP. By the middle of the 19th century, Europe had left China and India in the dust. That rise of commercial capitalism that enabled Europe to sprint ahead had shifted across the Atlantic. And ever since then, liberal democracies in North America and in Western Europe have really ruled the roost. Well, that's now changing, and power is flowing back to the east. If you look at the projections of various banks and accounting firms, and these are obviously imprecise because nobody knows, but in 2050, in 2060, the four largest economies in the world will be number one, China, number two, India, number three, US, and number four, Indonesia. And China's economy is predicted to be 70% larger than the American economy. That's a brave new world. It's going to take time to get there. The economic distribution of power is shifting more quickly than the military distribution of power, but we know from history that when powers become wealthy, they always eventually translate economic heft into geopolitical heft. So we're headed into a very different world than the one that we've been living in. And then I think the second big shift, the ideological shift, is that the progressive march of history, the tilt in the arc of history toward more liberty and toward more freedom, which began with the French and the American revolutions, that shift, that arc, that direction of change has begun to tilt backwards. The world is becoming progressively less free. Autocracies are getting more autocratic. Liberal democracies are becoming less liberal. And those countries that used to be tilting in the direction of democratic transitions have begun to shift in the other direction. And we don't know whether this is a reasonably temporary phenomenon, it's been going on now for about 10, 15 years, or whether this really is something that is more durable. But it does mean that this decentralization of power is coupled with the decentralization of ideology. And that's why I think we're going to be living in a world that will be multipolar, multicentric, globalized. And that world we will be in for the first time in history. Because we've lived in multipolar worlds before, but they were not interdependent and they were not globalized. To take us back to 1700, yes, China and India were dominant powers, but there was also the Tokugawa shogunate, the Ottoman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire. So there were really 5 centers of power in the world, but they had very little to do with each other. And as a consequence, the whole issue of global governance and managing the global commons never emerged because there wasn't a global commons. Well, today there is a global commons, right? We are all, to use a political science term, smushed together, rowing in the same boat when it comes to climate change, cybersecurity, pandemics, migration. But at the same time, this globalized, interdependent world will no longer be run, to be politically incorrect, by white Anglo-Saxon men. Because globalization and interdependence really was managed first from London and then from Washington, but those days are behind us. And so the big question in my mind is, how can we mediate the onset of globalized multipolarity without seeing the world gravitate toward disorder? How can we deal with ideological dividing lines and geopolitical dividing lines and multiple centers of power without at the same time falling short of dealing with climate and pandemics and cybersecurity and nuclear proliferation and all these kinds of intractable challenges that will require cooperation across political dividing lines? Now, there are those who say that the world that we're headed toward is a world that we've seen before, and that is a world divided into 2 hostile camps, democracies on one side, autocracies on the other. Yes, this is the world that is re-emerging as a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I don't think that it is useful to pull out the Cold War playbook. I think those of us who believe that we can simply follow the formula that we followed in the 20th century to defeat the Soviet Union, that's not going to work in the world that lies ahead. And let me just tick off several ways in which I think this next world will be far more challenging than the Cold War of the 20th century. Number one, China is a far more formidable competitor than Russia, right? Russia topped out at around 55% of American GDP. China is expected to surpass America in terms of global wealth, probably within about 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And then it would start moving pretty far ahead. There was just a report released by an Australian think tank. I can't testify to its accuracy, but it said that in 44 key technologies, cutting-edge technologies, 38 of them are in the hands of China. China leads in those areas. You think about Russia, what companies has Russia built that are world-class? Gazprom. That's about it. China has world-class companies on drones, on AI, on digital payments, on solar. There was an interesting article in the paper, I don't know, a couple of days ago, that the new cutting-edge technology on electric vehicles is sodium batteries, moving from lithium to sodium. Where's that being done? China. Where are they being produced? China. Yes, they don't have large amounts of sodium. We do, but this gives you some sense of a country that is making the transition from the industrial era to the digital era. And their high-tech and entrepreneurial sector is, as far as I know, talking to the experts, about equal to Silicon Valley. So this is a country that will be a full-service superpower over time. The second thing that I think is going to be quite different is the global South will not tuck in neatly to one camp or the other, which is why I think we're headed toward multipolarity and bipolarity. You know, the Chinese have made pretty clear that they're not going to tether themselves to either the West or to China or to Russia or to anyone else. They are going to navigate their own course. As their foreign minister recently put it, we're headed toward a multi-alignment world. And it's worth keeping in mind that most of the countries in the world today are not taking sides in a war that is crystal clear, right? Russia's invasion of Ukraine constitutes a bald act of aggression against its neighbor. We're not going to have a lot of better test cases to see how countries in the global South are going to align themselves. But this, to me, says this world that we're headed into is going to be a lot more complicated, a lot more unpredictable, a lot messier than the bipolar world of the 20th century Cold War. Two final features of this next world that I think are going to be particularly challenging. One is interdependence. I've already talked about that. And then the fourth is that the West prevailed in the Cold War in part because it was politically healthy. We are not politically healthy today. We are a big hot mess. And as a consequence, I do think that we need to consider our internal re-consolidation as well as how we manage a global multipolar system. In fact, I think that for me, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth priorities when I think about getting ready for globalized multipolarity is how to restore America's political center. How to make sure that the next president of France is not Marine Le Pen. And I think the chances of that are actually reasonably good, given what is happening to Macron and the protests that are taking place in the street. I see the dissolution of our political centers, the political dysfunction and gridlock that has befallen the United States and many other Western partners as posing a much greater threat to the West and to the West's ability to manage this coming world than the threat posed by Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. And that's because if we get our lights back on, I'm pretty confident we will deal with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin or whoever comes next. If we don't, I don't think we're going to deal successfully with what will be a very complicated geopolitical landscape. Let me conclude by just highlighting what I take to be the four items that would be at the top of my to-do list in thinking about the conversations we should have and where we go from here. First point, we need to have this conversation. This conversation is not taking place. What's happening is that the Chinese and the Russians are saying, we know what we don't want, We don't want an international system dominated by the West. We're going to bring it down. But they don't say what they will replace it with. They don't have the ideas. Here in Washington, and I'll let Canadians speak for themselves, and I'm guessing there's some Europeans in the room, the conversation is really one of sticking one's head in the sand and doubling down. We're not going to give an inch. The West will win. China will end up on the ash heap of history, as Nikki Haley put it a couple of weeks ago. Really? Is China really going to end up on the ash heap of history? Those of us who are out there talking about figuring out a way forward, a shared leadership with China, bringing the war in Ukraine to an end, short of the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, we are immediately put in the Museum of Appeasement next to Neville Chamberlain. Right? That's the kind of political atmosphere that we live in. We need to fix that, because this is a conversation that needs to take place. And I applaud you guys for helping trigger that conversation. Second point, I do think we need to think long and hard about what does polycentrism look like? What does it mean to live in a world of not an order, but multiple orders? How can we create a kind of live and let live system where different parts of the world have their own set of rules and practices, but still cooperate at the global level in a way that allows us to tackle big global challenges? I mean, multicentrism, polycentrism, multipolarity, we have a language for it, but we need to turn that language into something concrete. I don't have the answers, but it seems to me that this is a critical issue here. And I don't think the answer is the UN. I don't think the answer is the G20. They will be helpful, but I think we need to think about how to balance our values and realist geopolitical realities, about what kinds of small groups we need to put together to foster cooperation across ideological and geopolitical dividing lines. 3, we need to de-risk without deglobalizing. We need to begin to figure out and unpack the digital era. To me, it is the digital era that is behind this mess that I have been describing. It's every bit as profound as the transition from the agricultural to the industrial era, right? The onset of AI, of automation, of quantum computing, of ChatGPT-4. These are innovations that are changing the way we live, the way we communicate, what we do, how we make a living. And it is causing socioeconomic dislocations in our societies in a way that are quite profound. Right? Look at the average income of working Americans. Look at inequality. Look at how automation, digitization, and globalization are impacting the guys that used to work on a GM production line making $32 an hour in real wages. That used to be the largest employer in the United States. Today, the largest employer in the United States is Walmart. What are you making at Walmart? I don't know, $11 an hour, $12 an hour if you're lucky. Right? That's why Donald Trump got elected. We need to figure out how to manage a world in which digital technology is moving forward at light speed. Social media, AI, we don't know. We're flying blind. We need to think this through, and in my mind, deal with these innovations through new public policies. 2 final comments. I do think that, as I mentioned, rebuilding strength, international governance starts at home. And I do believe that given the size of the United States, given how important U.S. leadership has been, we really do need to think about a new brand of what I would call progressive populism, about moving away from the neoliberal overreach of the 1990s, letting the market rule, about a pragmatic realism and not liberal overreach aimed at turning Afghanistan and Iraq into Ohio, right? The US has been overfiring now for quite some time, and we need, I think, to figure out a new foreign policy that is much more reflective of geopolitical realities, right? I'm all for American exceptionalism. I think America has made the world a better place. America, working with Canada and its European allies, have bent the arc of history. But we need to temper our ideological ambition with geopolitical realities in a much more systematic way. Finally, I do, in the end of the day, end up in an optimistic place. And that optimistic place leads me to believe that this moment of transition, when the arc of history has begun to bend back towards less freedom, this will be reversed. But it will not be reversed because we defeat China, right? It will not be reversed because we go out and vanquish those people who don't share our values. It will be because we ultimately get our own houses in order, outperform and outmatch the competition, and thereby convince the rest of the world that in a globalized, multipolar era, your best bet for security and prosperity is to head down the road of liberal democracy. Right now, we are not offering that model. We're offering a different model. Become a liberal democracy and face gridlock and paralysis. And that's why I think it is so important that we fix ourselves here at home and again go out and exert, as Biden likes to say, not just our power, but the power of our example. Getting our houses in order and being geopolitically patient is, in my mind, the way that ultimately we will again bend the arc of history in the right direction. Thank you. How about you, Zach?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zachary Pakin. I'm a non-resident research fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, as well as a researcher for the Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS, in Brussels. My great pleasure to welcome all of you here today, and thank you, Charlie, for those really stimulating sets of remarks to get us kicked off today. Before I invite the rest of the panel to join us up here, just a couple of follow-up questions to your keynote address. You drew a distinction between the balance of power multipolarity that is occurring on the one hand, on the material side of the equation, and the balance of power that is evolving and emerging in the normative or perhaps even civilizational sense. So on the one hand, you've got diffuse centers of power, and on the other hand, you've got a crisis of authority, as it were. And those are two interrelated but nonetheless distinct challenges. So I'm wondering if in your perspective, if it's possible to dissect that a little bit more. Do material multipolarity and normative multipolarity call for different policy responses, possibly even contradictory foreign policy responses on the part of the United States and its allies?
I mean, I do think, Zach, that the two dimensions are interlinked in the sense that, and here I would differ with people like John Eikenberry and other liberal internationalists, that, I think that the appeal of Pax Americana, the spread of democracy over the last century, was in part a function of American power, right? Democracy attached to an aircraft carrier and a big dollop of aid looks a lot more attractive than without. And as I saw someone tweet, I guess maybe last night when I was trolling around, China shows up in Africa and offers an airport. The United States shows up in Africa and offers a lecture about how to be a democracy. Right? If you're an African government, what are you going to say yes to? An airport or a harangue? I would, if it were me, I'd ask for the airport. And the reality is that 2/3 of the world now trades more with China than with the United States. China has become the lender of last resort throughout the global South. It's not surprising to me that as a consequence, you see countries tilting toward China, looking to the Chinese model of governance because it seems to have worked. That having been said, I guess I'm enough of a universalist to believe that we, lucky enough to live in democratic societies, do have a leg up in this competition. And that is, I think the yearning for dignity and freedom is in fact universal. And as a consequence, ultimately the world will tilt in that direction. But we would be naive to think that we now face an uphill battle in a world in which it's China that is out there building airports, building highways, building bridges, and running around in a way that we can't do anymore.
There's a great foreign policy branding opportunity there. An airport or a harangue. It could be a hangar or a harangue. What would you like, a hangar or a harangue? But one more question before we open it up, and I think we'll have time maybe just for one audience question, because I know that Charlie, you need to leave early as well, so I want to give people the chance to ask you a question as well. But on the question of multipolarity and diverse centers of power, polycentrism, it raises the question of who qualifies as poles in this multipolar world, and as you alluded to in your remarks, Russia is certainly a much less of a candidate to be recognized as a pole than China is, and certainly the way that Russia has performed in this war has caused many people to question whether or not Russia is still a great power. That may or may not be the case. It could be that Russia could rebuild its strength. It could be that great powers lose wars to smaller powers all the time, which the United States has done in Vietnam and the like. But putting all that aside, if Russia is indeed not a pole, if it is a middle power or a major power, but not a great power and pole, how should that influence America's approach to dealing with Russia specifically in the context of approaching a multipolar world more generally?
Well, I think that we need to define poles flexibly, partly on the basis of material strength, GDP, and size of military, but also practice and how much influence we think they have. And I do think that that Russia is a pole, should be thought of as a pole, even though they are, by any measure, a declining middle power. But they do have 11 time zones and lots of nuclear weapons and control over what Mackinder called the pivot, the heartland. And as a consequence, I think we dismiss Russia and its geopolitical influence at our peril. Now, Russia is, in my mind, going to be in the penalty box for a very long time because of its invasion of Ukraine. And how we sort of get back to a constructive relationship, I don't know. But I do think that if you think about who needs to be at the table, if we are to start having conversations in a multi-centric, polycentric format, Russia needs to be there.
Now just to our audience to see if there are any questions for Charlie specifically before we move on to the panel. Yes, over in the far end of the room.
I just bring it up. You talk about China, becoming the new power and thing, but you've not mentioned China's rock bottom low birth rate and increasing aging of population, especially compared to India. Is that going to be a factor in China's future rise? Could it be getting old before it gets rich? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have time to discuss China's vulnerabilities, and it's got plenty of them, including the one that you just mentioned, including huge debt, a massively overheated real estate sector, slowing growth, deindustrialization as jobs are automated or moved to lower wage economies like Vietnam. So, you know, they are, you know, they don't have smooth sailing ahead of them. But I would ask, number one, are their problems so much more daunting than ours? And on your particular point, they have, you know, 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of people. We've got 330 million. The demographic projections that I've seen suggest that China will lose 8% of its population by 2050. So that means, I don't know, let's pick a number, 1.25 billion instead of 1.4 billion. That's still a lot of people. Yes, India has begun to, at least according to something I read, I think 2 days ago in the Washington Post, they're now surpassing China in terms of total population. And they're to some extent skipping over the industrial era and digitizing in a very impressive way. So I don't want to portray China as, you know, this 100-foot tall gorilla with no chinks in the armor. It's got plenty of chinks, but I'm someone who thinks that they generally know what they're doing. China has a reasonably competent government, and we need to deal with the China that we have, not the China that we want.